Hi, Ted Morrissey here doing a video for my course in Lindenwood University's MFA in Writing program. We've just finished our first round of workshop, so I think it's official. I think the students who have gone through that process are now officially embarked on their MFA program and hopefully are feeling pretty good about it at this point. I wanted to talk about some bigger picture issues as we kind of move forward and as we start to think of ourselves perhaps more firmly, substantially as writers and artists and so on, writers, poets, etc., and so on. That considering some of these bigger picture issues is worthwhile. And since I keep alluding to this bad boy, Fiction and the Figures of Life, by this guy, William H. Gass, that guy, William H. Gass. I thought I would dip into it a little bit for some of those bigger picture issues. Remember, this is a book of essays of a sort of craft nature, although they tend to be more theoretical, more philosophical, and not as kind of nuts and bolts-ish as we often find in craft books where the writers are really zeroing in on some very specific techniques. Gass does to some extent, but like I said, it's really more about the philosophy of being a writer, being an artist, and some theoretical issues that he raises and so forth. I wanted in particular, though, to draw from the last essay in the series, The Artist and Society, which was originally published in the New Republic, I think in 1968. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure about that. I didn't take the chance to double check that, but late 60s for sure, because Fiction and the Figures of Life came out in 1970, so all of the pieces were from sort of the mid to late 60s. And The Artist and Society is just a really terrific article. It's not very long. It's one of his shorter essays, in fact, but it talks about the artist, including the literary artist, and sort of their place in society, and covers quite a few aspects of that, even though it's a brief essay. But I just want to turn to one part of it in particular and make this a very brief kind of video. But he gets into this idea of the writer. Again, he always is speaking of the artist in this essay, but I'm going to kind of substitute writer and poet for that. But of living these split lives. And what he means by that is we're living the life of the mind. We're creating art. We're creating stories, poems, essays, screenplays, whatever it might be. So we're living the life of the mind, but most of us have to be a part of the more practical world as well. We have to have jobs. We have responsibilities with our partners and our spouses and our families, and just as citizens in the country, we have to vote. We have to be informed on, political issues, hopefully, and those kinds of things. So we're kind of living these dual lives. And what Gass says about that is, it's hard, he says, and for that the world is partly to blame. It does not want its artists, after all. It especially does not want the virtues which artists must employ in the act of their work, lifted out of prose and paint and plaster into life. So he's acknowledging the difficulty of being a writer and a poet, etc., in the world, because the world is demanding other things from us, generally speaking, than our art, right? And so he says, well, what are some of these virtues? Right? He says the world does not want the virtues that artists need to have to be successful. And he isn't talking financially successful. He's talking about artistically, aesthetically successful. And so I'm just going to read through very briefly. It's a kind of a 2-page spread where he talks about these different virtues. And I'm just going to kind of summarize them, read a little bit, and that will be that. But he says one is honesty, the ability to see precisely what's been done, the ability to face up, because the artist wants his every line to be lovely. That's quite natural. He wants to think well of himself. Of course, Gass, writing in the 60s, was using the male pronoun, but today we would make that plural or somehow deal with that, and cover himself with his own praise like the sundae with its syrup. But he says artists have to be honest. They have to be willing to face up to the truth of things, the truth of the world, the truth of themselves, and so on. And it's difficult to be honest sometimes, right? It makes one vulnerable. So that's one of the virtues that artists need. Presence is another. The artist cannot create when out of focus. He is not another theatrical performance. There's no one to impress, no audience. Presence is a state of concentration on another to complete. It leaves you quite so complete, rather, it leaves you quite without defense, altogether open. So to really be keenly observant and in the moment, now, I mean, Gass was writing decades before the cell phone and the internet and all that sort of thing. But I think today he would emphasize, even more importantly, that it's very easy to be distracted. How often have we been crowded places and practically everyone is on their cell phone, kind of in their own little world, not even knowing what anyone else is doing or saying? And Gass would say that for an artist, that's bad, that you really need to be in the moment and observing what's going on around you, taking note of it. Just as an example, we know James Joyce, carried, pieces of paper and pencils and crayons around with him. And he was constantly writing down bits of dialogue that he would overhear in the cafe, bits of conversation, ideas that would pop into his head while he was out walking and just kind of seeing the world and talking to people. He loved having people come over to his apartment. He would fix a fancy meal, well, maybe not fancy, but hearty at least, with lots of white wine to wash it down with. And then they would turn on the radio, which was a brand new technology, and listen to opera, coming from various parts of Europe and even England and Ireland when he was living in Paris and places like that. And he would really observe like what people were saying, how they were reacting to the opera, bits of dialogue during dinner, always present and copying down observations and then using them, in his fiction, right? Unity is another, says Gass. The artist does not create with something special called imagination, which he has and you haven't. He can create with his body because that body has become a mind. He can create with his feelings because they've turned into sensations. He thinks in roughness, loudness, and in color. So again, I think this is sort of related to that last part about being present, that you've got to be in the world physically in order to observe those things that you need to observe. Now, that isn't to say that, the writer doesn't also have time alone where they're contemplating, where they're reading, where they're doing research, where they're listening to music to be inspired by, or whatever it might be. So it isn't that you have to constantly be out in the world, but when you are out in the world, you have to be present and you have to be kind of moving around and sort of experiencing the sensations of the world. I wrote a foreword for a friend's book of poetry a couple of years ago, and I used some experiences that I had in a bazaar in Morocco. A bazaar where there's all these shopkeepers and they've got all these different things for sale, and you go through and you look at them and you haggle over prices and blah blah blah. And it's just from a sensation standpoint, there's just so much going on. There's so much to see. There's so much to smell. There's so many languages at work, and the feel of the temperature and all that stuff. And so be aware of your physical body, and then integrate that into your poetry, into your fiction, into your creative nonfiction, and so forth, right? Another virtue, awareness is another. Honesty, concentration, unity of being, these allow in the artist the world to be seen, an unimaginable thing to most of us, to fully take in a tree, a tower, a hill, a graceful arm. If you've ever had an artist's eye fall on you, you'll know what I mean. Gass was really into photography most of his life and was a really great black and white photographer, and color too. But I think of his photography mainly in black and white. But he did do some color work. But anyway, that was kind of part of his really focusing in on details. And as a writer, that's just super important. And again, our lives are so fast paced. It's so easy to gloss over the details. We might have a general impression about what we just experienced, but to really be in the moment and taking notice of all the finer points that we then can use in our art, that's the virtue that Gass is talking about. Let me go on to the next, let me skip one and go down to totality is still another. I mean that the artist dare not fail to see the whole when he sees with the whole of him. He sees the ant in the jam, yet the jam remains sweet. He must fall evenly on all sides like a cloak. If he stops to sing a single feeling, he can do so well because he knows how feelings move. So totality, and I think what Gass is getting at here is that you have to see it all. You have to see a person's complete sort of persona, their good qualities, their not so great qualities. You have to see a situation for its pluses and its minuses. You can't be subjective and idiosyncratic in terms of, well, I'm just going to report on the great things that happened at this event and ignore the terrible things that happened, and vice versa. You don't want to dwell on just the terrible. You want to take in the whole totality of the experience and then try to integrate that into your poem, into your fiction, whatever it might be. All right. So again, as we kind of move forward and we're reading each other's work and we're just kind of getting serious about this program and kind of moving forward as writers and poets and creative nonfiction writers and so forth, I think considering some of these virtues that Gass talks about, it isn't that we don't have them, I don't think. It's that they maybe are unpracticed in a lot of cases. And I know even today, I have to try to be mindful of them. I come back to this essay frequently. I've quoted from it frequently for a lot of papers and presentations that I've done. But even beyond that, every few months, I'll kind of just pull it out. It's on the bookcase right behind me. I'll just kind of pull it out and just read from it because it really reminds me of some really important issues that as a writer, it's something I should be mindful of, and it's easy to forget. All right, I'm going to stop there and see what you think about all that.